Welcome everyone, I'm Calypso Nicolaidis, Professor of International Relations and member of this European Studies Center, as well as Chair of CSOX, which is, CSOX, as you all know, is co-sponsoring this event. Its director is Othon Anastasakis here, and the event is co-sponsored indeed by CSOX and PEFM, the Program on Financial Markets. So it's about the region and it's about the world and it's the concerns that we always have. And we're very, very happy to have today with us Vicky Pryce, who hardly needs an introduction. And indeed, there is so much that she's done in her life that I won't tell it all. But let me simply mention that she's had a very illustrious career, both as a chief economist in various institutions and on the academic side. So she was partner and chief economist at KPMG. She's worked in the oil sector. She's co-founder of Good Corporation on corporate social responsibility, an issue that we all care about. Her other recent posts include Senior Managing Director at FTI Consulting, Director General for Economics at the Department for Business Innovation and Skills, BIS, most recently, and Joint Head of the UK Government Economics Service. And indeed, at the same time, I don't know how you juggle these things, and I'm not even going to start to try to guess, but she has been in various more research institutions, the Council of the Royal Economy Society, the Council of the University of Kent, the Board of Trustees for RSA, LSE, and indeed she has also spent time here at Nuffield College and as well as in Queen Mary. She is, of course, a well-known author. In the very same year, she published Greekonomics and Prisonomics. And since these days we talk about how Greece is in a golden prison, you know, maybe there's a kind of synthesis of, between the two sides, Vicky. And indeed today we're going to have a conversation really, because the title of this talk is, saving the economy, which itself has a question mark. And then what will happen next? So I think that what we want to ask you, Vicky, is first to tell us, how did we get here? How did we get into this mess, Greece and Greece in Europe, according to you, and from the different vantage points that you've had, and then indeed what to do next. And from what we said, you will introduce in a kind of short way, and what we really want to do is also have a conversation.
Sure, well thank you for this introduction. As you heard, I worked a lot for the UK government for about 8 years, so I was chief economist in charge of one bit. Well, I was jointly doing this with somebody else in the Treasury, and we took over from Nick Stern. So I was really focusing a lot on the UK and its international standing and productivity and all that sort of stuff. But of course, then we had the financial crisis and we spent a lot of time trying to rescue the UK. I wasn't paying very much attention to what was happening in Greece. And then, of course, the Greek crisis erupted too, just as we were coming out of it in 2010. And I have to admit that since I left Greece quite a few decades ago, I sort of enjoyed going backwards and forwards and so on, but I had really not bothered too much about looking at the economy. And of course, the moment the crisis hit, and we'll talk about that in a minute in terms of how it got there in Greece, everyone started seriously attacking Greece and the Greeks, the sort of caricatures of, they're all lazy, profligate, they don't like paying the taxes, they're corrupt and all that sort of stuff. And of course, up to a point that's true. I have to admit, but you could cross out Greece and put Italy, and it's not very dissimilar, really. And in fact, I've given loads of talks to audiences where there have been Italians, Spaniards, etc., and some of the Eastern Europeans who've joined since, and they say similar things exist there too. And yet, this sort of attack on the Greeks really irritated me, and I started speaking out, if you like, not necessarily in defence of them, but trying to see how you can get out of this crisis. And of course, everyone latched on to me in the sense that suddenly there was a Greek who could speak reasonable English. Of course, most Greeks do, but with an English name. Not everyone realised I was actually Greek, and they suddenly did. And I found myself defending Greece, if you like. But of course, it really was a tragedy to a considerable extent, and has been a tragedy ever since. So in terms of how we got there, I have to admit I was always very, and some people in the room know this, anti the euro. And there is no doubt that the Eurozone is not an optimal currency area, and there are loads of the things that we've seen happening once the crisis hit were predictable. And this is one of the reasons why a number of us were keen on the UK joining. So when I worked for the government, I was involved in the 5 economic tests, which basically, I mean, admittedly, it was a political decision at the end, but made the economic case for not joining the euro. And one of the things that had really, sort of worried me when I was looking ahead at what was going to happen was the fact that when I was at KPMG, before I joined the government, I had started something called the Euro Service, which it doesn't sound fantastically sort of innovative as a term, but nevertheless it did what it said on the tin. It helped firms look across the Eurozone as the euro was about to be introduced and rethink their strategic and organizational issues. So obviously you had to price everything in euros in the future. Obviously things would be much more transparent in terms of prices across. You couldn't rely on the lira devaluing all the time for the fact that you had very high prices in Italy and nobody noticed. And of course there'd be parallel imports taking place. If you sold your products more cheaply in one place, clearly it could be bought from somewhere else. But then we were looking, that's fine, that's organizational stuff. It increases some of your costs, reduces some others. Transparency, the name of the game. You couldn't charge the same, different things across. That's fine. Wages would have to go up in places like Greece and maybe down somewhere else. All these things are manageable. But what would happen if you got a crisis? And all we could think of in the late 90s, early 2000s was, or late 90s really, was an oil crisis, perhaps. But let's say it's an oil crisis, and there is no institutional framework behind to support any of the countries, no transfers of funds. It was quite obvious this wasn't going to be the case. And as we were moving into the 2000s, I mean, it was quite obvious that there was no framework around the euro to support anyone. So a good case was pharmaceutical companies selling to Greece. So there was one pharmaceutical company we worked for. So we said, well, you have to do scenario planning, like I used to do in the oil sector. You have to just see how you can survive. So here we are, a country like Greece, hit by something, and there is no way in which it can devalue, and therefore suddenly, economy drops, GDP drops, and obviously your revenues are very low. And you have a real problem in terms of what you do next. What you do next, of course, is you have to have internal devaluation, and the government has to cut back on spending very significantly in order to tackle both the deficit and the debt. So you, pharmaceutical company, won't get paid because obviously the health sector will be affected. There will be no money, and therefore you need to prepare for that eventuality, because it's very likely this will happen. So it's quite obvious when you look at it from a company viewpoint, you're doing their strategy, that in fact this thing won't work. I mean, it's very basic, without any support mechanism there. And in fact, when the crisis hit, the planes to Greece were full of pharmaceutical companies trying to get their money back, which of course took them a long time to get. In the end, if you recall, the European Commission has had to issue, because it wasn't just Greece, directives, more or less, forcing countries to pay back what they owed to pharmaceutical companies between the year this, and then the next years will be done through a different directive. So they gave them some time to pay them back. So it was very obvious that this would be the case. So what this brings us back down to is, Greece joined a group, a regional group, which was on the face of it unsustainable. And if the crisis were to hit, then it wouldn't have anywhere to turn to except cut back wages very substantially, and of course spending, etc., etc. And this is more or less what happened, of course, not more or less, but even more. So when the crisis hit, Greece, which has done absolutely nothing to improve its productive capacity and its productivity generally, was hit even harder than others. And of course, there was this whole issue about did they overspend at the Olympics? Did they hide the deficit, the size of the deficit to Eurostat? So when Papandreou discovered and his finance minister discovered how big the deficit was, it was a bit of a shock, and there was no way they could sort of fix it, which of course put Greece in a very bad position, and everyone started calling them liars and everything, and all that sort of stuff. But it was obvious that the situation could not be sustained unless there was something radical that happened. What else happened during happens in the Eurozone is that, of course, when you have a single currency, single interest rate, and no longer a concern about your exchange rate being affected by movements of goods and services in terms of what it does, in terms of the demand and supply for your currency, you no longer have a balance of payments constraint. And of course, if you don't have a balance of payments constraint, and you can borrow relatively easily, you borrow and you buy things from Germany, which is actually what the Greeks did. And if as a country, as a government, your interest rates go down in terms of what you can borrow, because the markets assumed that the credit risk of all countries in Europe were the same, so Greek interest rates fell from 18% down to about 2%. That's borrowing 10-year yields went down to that. 10-year bonds, the yields went down to about 2%. It was exactly the same as Germany and all the other countries, because the credit markets assumed that the credit risk was about the same in all the countries, because they assumed wrongly that no country would be allowed to default and there would be support from everybody else, which was a joke, of course, because that is not at all what was in. Remember, the Maastricht Treaty said no bailouts. We've had some bailouts since, of course, because Germany has always backed down, but that was the idea. But the markets ignored it, and of course they assumed that the credit risk was the same. So if you are in a position where you can borrow quite cheaply, it wasn't necessarily the Greek consumer that borrowed an awful lot. It was the Greek government, of course, that borrowed considerable amounts, as happened in some of the other countries. Elsewhere, like in Spain, it was the consumer, or at least through the banking system, that built lots of houses, the same in Ireland. In Greece, it was mostly the public sector. And it's interesting. You can borrow very cheaply, you don't worry about your balance of payments, and therefore you don't necessarily need to do any reforms. Your economy is growing quite fast, in any case, because of these cheap interest rates. You think everything's going fine. But of course, that can't go on to the moment there is a crisis and there is no support from anybody else. So the Greeks did not invest seriously in improving their competitiveness, and neither did any of the other countries, really, except, as I said, in houses, which Adair Turner has described as sort of useless type of investment. And of course, in those places too, there's been a big serious issue in relation to how they reacted to the crisis when it hit, because of course the markets then realised that they weren't all the same credit risk, and of course Greek rates rose to some ridiculous level. In fact, I think for 3-year bonds, rates went up to something like 45%, I think, over that period. It was just extraordinary what happened. So it meant basically they couldn't borrow any longer in the capital markets. And yet the Greek population had not been profligate. You remember what I said at the beginning about how people were talking about them all retiring early and enjoying lying on the beach, which of course makes huge sense if you are Greek. Or if you're a foreigner, really. You can't do it in many other countries, but you can certainly do it in Greece. Nevertheless, the Greeks worked longer, if we believe the figures, than any country in Europe, and certainly considerably longer than the Germans.
Maybe hours. Not longer life.
Longer hours.
Retirement.
Longer hours. Yes.
There is an OECD study. Yeah.
Yes, longer hours. And the Greek households were borrowing least in relation to their disposable incomes. than practically any country in the Eurozone before the crisis hit. And the Greek companies were borrowing least in relation to as a percentage of GDP than most of the other countries in the Eurozone did. So it wasn't a nation that really believes in borrowing an awful lot, at least the individuals, but certainly the government did. So it's a myth, if you like. One of the things that I wanted to explain on TV and radio and whatever I've written is that this caricature is wrong. Yes, they retired early, but look what's been going on in France with all the air traffic control strikes because they don't want to retire later, or labour reforms in Italy where an academic rides his bicycle, attaches it to the railings of the Ministry of Labour and then gets shot dead because they have suggested changes to labour laws. Greece is not an exception in this. It may be slightly more extreme, but it is certainly not an exception in this. And then, of course, a number of things happened, just in terms of how we got here, in terms of the debt and so on. Yeah. I mean, obviously, there was an awful lot that was borrowed by the government, but and the deficit was quite large, but it wasn't unacceptably large. I mean, you probably all remember what happened in Ireland, where
the director of the program, our late friend Max Wetson, was a director at the Central Bank of Ireland. So we had lots of comparative. Ireland-Greece is a big theme in this room.
So perhaps I don't need to say it again, but nevertheless.
Yes, Ireland is familiar.
Ireland is familiar.
Also in many ways, yeah.
Right. So, all right, let's assume that Ireland is familiar. But the interesting thing is, where has Ireland ended up now? It's supposed to be the great success story. It's exited the bailout.
Not to everyone.
Not to everyone, all right. So of course, what happens when you have a euro area, and maybe I'll say slightly different to what you've discussed here before, credit risk is the same across Europe. You can move the money around very easily, of course, because really the reason for having the euro is that you no longer need to have capital controls to just sustain your currency. So you have a proper single market. So that's pretty good. So you complete it all. You have freedom of movement of people, freedom of movement of capital as well, that allows for the single market to operate. And of course, as a bank, you say, well, great, this is a big area in which we can now operate. So banks in Europe, some banks in Europe became global banks, or at least they thought, great, we can become a global bank, and they did a few silly things, but overall they became rather large. And when the crisis hit in Ireland, so the main bank ended up having a balance sheet which was larger than the GDP of the economy as a whole, which would be fine if there was sharing of risk across Europe, but there isn't. So it was the national government that had to take on the debt to save the banks. And of course that meant that its deficit to GDP ratio rose to 35%, which is pretty high and very difficult to deal with in the short term. And that was another example of the failure of the Eurozone system to deal with a crisis of this sort. And hence why we're now moving to the banking union, which allows for a single regulatory supervisory authority, which is the European Central Bank, and a single resolution regime, which allows for banks to be closed down. Not a single, unfortunately, deposit insurance scheme, but at least to ensure that some of these things won't happen again. But it did still stem from the failure of the fact that there was no mutualization of risks that those banks did, and it fell back to the individual governments. Well, similarly in Greece, because of course the French banks and the German banks had all lent an awful lot of money via the Greek system, and it looked perilously close in 2010 to collapsing, and of course what the Western banks wanted to do was try and exit it in a reasonable way. So what happened is there was this huge transfer of debt from the banks which were in trouble, the German and French banks, for example, or Italian banks, to the individuals in Greece who took on all this debt themselves. So there was this debt became a Greek individual taxpayer's debt, where it should have been a banking resolution debt, if you want to call it that, or at least it should have been, money should have gone straight to save the banks rather than being added to the country's deficit and debt, which is what happened. And with the second bailout, it was even worse. So basically, most of the money that has come into Greece has gone to recapitalize the banks, pay back debt that was already had already incurred, and compensate countries for and individual banks and institutions for the haircuts they had to endure in 2012 when the situation got even worse. Very, very little has gone to the Greek government and to individuals. In fact, with the second bailout, some 6 billion went to the country itself, if you like, out of about 120 that the bailout was euros, which is an extraordinarily small number. And of course, lots of contractors were not paid. Companies have gone bankrupt. So it is pretty extraordinary that this has been accepted, and that the people who did the in my view the negotiations, like Papademos, allowed this to happen. Our technocrat prime minister, temporarily running the country, got us into this deal, which of course was mainly again to save the banks rather than anything else. Of course, we need banks to operate. What's happened with other countries, because they realised that this can't go on like this, is that by the time the Spanish crisis came, the banking crisis, which required just as much money as the Greek banks did, there was a stability mechanism established. It now has roughly 500 billion pledge for it, which goes directly to the banking system and is not added to the country's own debt. Which makes a huge difference. The only reason why Spain is doing all right is because it didn't have to endure that transfer of debt from the banking sector to the individual taxpayer, which the Greeks had to have. So that's how we got to having this enormous debt, which now everyone realizes should never ever have been negotiated. Do you want to ask me the next question?
Yes. If we got into this huge mess, and you've brilliantly summarized how we got here. I mean, I would push you. I mean, it's interesting to hear how you frame it, and clearly there's a lot that speaks to kind of a bias, almost an anti-Greek bias, or maybe we were the initial guinea pigs, or because Greece was the first country to have to negotiate these things. Maybe there were some other biases, and I'm sure that people in the audience will want to push you on your diagnosis. But let's ask now, well, where do we go from here? Given that we are in this mess, where do we go from here? And Merkel and others, will they yield to enough of Syriza demands that Syriza can save face and say yes to a third bailout?
Okay, I think to be able to answer that, we need to see how big the problem actually is. So, remember that Greece now has a debt to GDP ratio of about 175 to 180%, which is, of course, unsustainable. When you look at the successful countries like Ireland and Portugal that have left their bailouts, they have debt to GDP ratios of between 120 and 130% themselves, which are unsustainable too, because of what I explained before, which is huge. So if Greece is dealt in a certain way in terms of its debt, then something has to happen with the rest as well. So we get back to that. So again, to remind everyone that Greece is not an outlier. But the amount of money we're talking about at present is tiny. I mean, the reason why Greece has such a big debt to GDP ratio is because of the austerity measures introduced by the IMF have led to a 25% decline in GDP. And as your GDP declines, your debt to GDP ratio obviously goes up. But the amounts that we're now talking about are tiny. So it's not beyond the ability of the
325 billion.
No, I don't mean that. I mean the amounts in the short term that need to be repaid. There may be 325 billion, but it's hugely greater for countries that are bigger. If you just look at 120, 130% of GDP. So the amounts are quite large elsewhere. And of course, the amounts that the Italians owe, since they have 137% of GDP, is even greater. So it's not huge. It may be huge in terms of a bailout that the IMF's been involved in, but it's not huge. But the individual bits that we're talking about, which have brought Greece to this point, have to do with the budgets for 2015 and beyond. And when the previous Prime Minister Samaras went to have his 2015 budget approved and to leave the bailout back in November, December, the difference between what he had presented, which was quite austere, and what the Europeans wanted was less than 2 billion. Less than 2 billion euros. So they sent him home packing. And because of 2 billion euros, we have ended up with a crisis in Europe, with Greece looking like it's going to, is bankrupt, basically, and without an ability to see a light at the end of the tunnel, and with Syriza being elected, which of course gives the Europeans loads and loads of headaches, having a left-wing, radical left-wing supposedly, even though it's quite middle of the road, most of it, party in power.
You're going to have to tell us why you consider it middle of the road.
Well, I think Tsipras is quite middle of the road, and quite a lot of his advisors are. There is a small faction, and also because I think most of the people...
In terms of their policies.
Yes, well, we get to... the policies are not... obviously, the fact that they've given up on so many of their policies has moved them to middle of the road. They're doing some silly things on education, for example, and some of their pension. There's no doubt about that. But a lot of the people who voted for Syriza are, in fact, PASOK supporters, or were, and people who are voted in as part of Syriza were PASOK before. Varoufakis was a PASOK, who's a finance minister, a PASOK advisor. And the little faction that was really left-wing was only getting 4% of the overall vote 10 years ago. So you can only assume that the rest of it is other voters who've come in from either sometimes New Democracy and sometimes PASOK as well. But anyway, but the amounts, as I was referring to before, in terms of what can be done. I mean, if you think that that quantitative easing at present, which has started, is costing the European Central Bank 60 billion a month, the Greek money that needs to be repaid to the ECB and the IMF, the short-term debt basically that they have, in the next month is about, which is causing a lot of headaches, is about 2 billion, 2.5 billion. They need to pay another 10 in the next year. You can only imagine, the ECB, and after all, a lot of it is for the ECB. There is the ECB throwing money at Europe and worrying about whether the Greeks will pay 200 million back to them, which causes yet another crisis and makes them raid their municipalities' reserves. I mean, it's nonsensical what's going on. So somebody needs to understand that this is nonsensical and therefore come up with a solution. And the solution I think that Tsipras is trying to get to is that they pay as much of that short-term debt as possible. And the rest of the debt, the huge amount that you mentioned, which doesn't really start even getting paid until 2020, and which has already quite low interest, gets rescheduled to even further. And I think the Varoufakis ideas of perpetual bonds, or whatever they're called, perpetuity bonds,
growth bonds.
the two types, the perpetual ones and the growth ones. The growth ones are linked to nominal GDP increase, and only get paid if you have a GDP growth faster than what's assumed in the yield that you're paying. Or the perpetual ones, which mean that basically they get rewound all the time and they're quite long term. So you never pay them back. Those would reduce very, very significantly the debt burden of Greece, which now is about 4% of GDP every year. So, and once you get rid of the ECBs and the IMF ones, life becomes hugely easier. So the question is how to get Greece from where it is now to that point of being able to survive with long-term debt that isn't going to be bothering it too much in the short term.
And is that possible if the rest of Europe is bent on not so much the economic rationality that you described, but the signaling that it would mean to yield to the demands of, as you were saying, a leftist party that doesn't go with the ordo-liberal order that Germany wants to impose on the rest of Europe?
Well, I mean, politics
how do you
intervenes all the time in a very unfortunate way, but of course we do know that the politics in Europe are such at present that there are a number of countries which have anti-austerity parties in them, which are challenging the more right-wing current governments. You have that in Poland, in Portugal, and you have that in Spain.
and elsewhere.
And elsewhere. So obviously the last thing they want is to suggest to the population that.
But everyone
Things can
sees
happen.
this pattern. You
Yes.
know, it's understood, that pattern. So how far can you go simply to kind
Well-
of not give ammunition to your leftist
But you
parties
see-
at home?
I know, but you see,
Are
you're
they-
not really giving anything to the Greeks because Greece was growing last year. It had a primary surplus, admittedly not very big, but it had a primary surplus if you exclude debt interest payments, which is extraordinary. I mean, Greece had achieved its remit, if you like. It had reduced its deficit from 15% down to 1 to 2%, 1.5, the actual deficit, and it had a primary surplus. So, you know, give me another country that's done that. I mean, it was extraordinary. So instead of being, and they had gone back and borrowed in the market. They borrowed twice on 3-year and 5-year bonds at reasonable yields, just under 5%. And the economy was growing, finally.
So it's all Syriza's fault.
No, I think it's the Europeans' fault. I mean, Syriza has not done the negotiating properly. There's no doubt about that. They've been useless at it. They have no idea how to do it. But the Europeans should have said, well done. Yes, they were worried about Samaras having gone back a bit on some of the things he had done, and that was completely unacceptable. Instead, they should have given him ammunition for not going back.
Of course.
And they didn't. I mean, to get into this crisis for 2 billion, since they were very happy with carrying, you know, having this type of bailout process happening, the 2 billion difference in terms of the budget presented and what they really wanted is incredibly illogical in my mind, and probably they didn't expect Syriza to be elected. So there they are.
So before we open up, tell us, and this is Danuta really wants to know, is there light at the end of the tunnel? What light do you see at the end of the tunnel? Even the very short-term tunnel or the middle-term tunnel? Where can we find that light?
Well, as far as the Greeks are concerned, they want an agreement. I'm not talking about the individual Greeks. Now, there are lots of Greeks in here, and they may have different view, but certainly me talking to the Greeks every day suggests to me that what they want is an end to this uncertainty, which is causing people not be able to sleep at night, not knowing whether their money is going to be safe in the banks. They want any agreement. That right now, they don't care if it's austerity or not. They just want to stay in the euro, to know that their money is safe. And that's the important thing. So any agreement would be a good agreement. And the reality is that most Greeks who voted for Syriza voted because they couldn't see a light at the end of the tunnel in any other way, and they thought they may bring it about, and they would be happy if only 2 out of 10 things that Syriza promised before the election come through. So the light, the immediate little tiny light would be some agreement which resulted in Greece staying in for the moment, and in the euro, which can allow things to perhaps resume, so that interest rates can come down. And if there is agreement, remember the most extraordinary thing, QE, quantitative easing, restricts the European Central Bank. I mean, this is a serious problem, as we know, with the banking sector liquidity at present. And that is because the bank is not allowed to buy, in its QE quantitative easing process, which is buying bonds in the secondary market across Europe, anything below a certain credit rating. I mean, sovereign bonds below a certain credit rating. Greek bonds are junk bonds, of course, in terms of the credit rating, so they're very, very low, so they can't buy them. But if a country is in a bailout program, then it can buy them. So if QE could suddenly buy Greek bonds, interest rates would just drop like anything, because they know that there is a backup of the ECB behind, and everything would go back to normal pretty quickly. But because Greece is under review, they can't buy those bonds. So what you need is this review period to finish as quickly as possible with some agreement, so that QE can actually happen in Greece as well. Can you imagine the difference it would make if the European Central Bank started buying it? But for the moment, it's telling the banking system, we can't use for the amount of liquidity we're giving you, you can't use Greek bonds as collateral, because it's junk bond days, we don't accept it. It's also telling them, don't buy treasury bills that the government is issuing to pay back whatever it is that they owe to us. I mean, which of course means that it's crippling the banking system. All this will change. So what you need is a change of not necessarily mentality, a change of confidence which will have a huge impact on Greece and signals you send to the market. So that's the light at the end of the tunnel. Now, and with it, so I think the Greeks will probably accept whatever austerity comes through, because at least it's now agreed that the primary surplus doesn't need to be as high as the Europeans originally wanted Greece to do. So it's a bit of leeway, as long as there is a return to some normality and they feel safe again. And I think that's the first little light. The second light is that with it, and as an acceptance of these tight measures which are still there is an agreement to look at restructuring the debt. It means nothing for those countries to restructure the debt. I mean, this is paper money we're talking about. It's paper money what goes on. Imagine the Greeks raid the SDR account in the International Monetary Fund to pay what they owe the IMF. I mean, and then when the money comes from the ECB in the disbursement, which is still, there's another 7 billion to be paid to the Greeks so they can pay the short-term debt, it moves into an escrow account, which the Greeks never see, and then it moves back to the ECB. I mean, it's a joke. You can just print that money. I mean, the ECB can just press a little button or do an electronic transfer, and this money's been printed, and no one would know. I mean, it makes no difference.
Well, Merkel and her government probably would know. I mean,
no. What I mean is that in the good old days, the banks used to do all sorts of.
But we're not in that world anymore. But
Great
yes,
shame.
I agree, and I'm sure many of us agree in the room. But given the reality principle, and that the central ECB cannot just do that because it would mean a kind of bailout. And in any case, this whole review theater is a way of signaling that Greece needs to do its homework. You can't just have your cake and eat it too, and Syriza needs to do its homework. But let me open it up. You can come back to all of these points, and thank you for these preliminary remarks, because at least there is some light at the end of the tunnel, but depends who listens to who. So let me start. Yes.